Hello, and welcome back to the Business of Compliance podcast, the podcast by executives for executives. Today, we have a very special guest. I would love to welcome for you, for our audience, Kevin Schawinski. Kevin, for those listeners, those viewers that might not necessarily know who you are and your backstory, why today's episode is so important, maybe you could share just a little bit about yourself before we kick off our dialogue.
It's great to be here, Patrick. And by way of background, so I'm originally from Switzerland, and I'm by training an astrophysicist. So I used to study distant black holes and galaxies using telescopes on the ground and in space. And then about 10 years ago, I got really into AI and machine learning. And of course, back then we thought it was a hype, but of course it was nothing like to what it is today. I decided to leave academia and actually start a company focused on responsible and trustworthy AI, which at the time everybody thought was really neat, but nobody wanted to pay for.
No.
And so about 3 years ago, I discovered what we now call the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. And I read what was written there, and I tried to understand what it would mean. And I realized this is going to be the biggest change in IT probably since data protection, since GDPR came. And so with my team, we basically thought about how to operationalize what was envisioned here. And as part of that, try to learn as much as I could, not just about AI, but also about how regulations are made and how technical standards are made, and in particular, how companies can live what's written in these documents, which are often written by non-technical people. And so as part of that, I'm involved in things at the EU Commission, at the new AI office, with the government here in Switzerland, but of course also in the United States. So we're part of the AI Safety Institute at NIST, where we work on technical standards for AI as well.
Kevin, that's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. As you're talking about your background, I think about the concept of consilience, this idea that rules or theories from one domain of science apply in others. Mm-hmm. And immediately I think, are there things that you learned or that you were trained on in your astrophysics career that have translated to give you an ability to maybe see things differently or think about things differently as it relates to AI safety, all those things that are really pressing issues for business leaders today?
So I'm trained as a physicist, and physicists, first of all, are lazy. I'd like to reduce everything to the simplest rules that explain what's going on. So figuring out what are the fundamental laws that are operational here. Like the black hole sounds super complicated, but when you distill it down, it's actually a very simple set of equations that tell you everything about it. The consequences are complicated,
Yes.
but the heart is very, very simple. And I try to do the same thing with AI as a technology, which I love and love doing, and of course work with even today. And then when I got to regulations, I thought about it in a similar way. Here are these enormously complicated documents. There are pages and pages of text that seems impenetrable. Like when I first looked at it, it was like
so consuming.
My eyes glazed over, and I said, let me break this down into what it is the writers are actually saying here and what they're intending. And that's sort of where I took my physics background to this problem. Yeah.
And what's so interesting is I think many of our viewers would describe the current regulatory landscape as a black hole in many ways. I mean, in the EU, we see things like the Digital Services Act. We see it, obviously, GDPR, the EU AI Act, NIST 2 as a directive, DORA. So many things are weighing on our current leaders in the EU and other areas overseas outside the US. And it does feel overwhelming. I'm sure it feels very much like being sucked into a black hole for those leaders. But I think with what you're doing, Kevin, you're offering those business leaders a perspective that allows them to be successful as they are navigating what would otherwise feel like an existential threat in so many ways.
I mean, it does feel overwhelming. And I think a lot of time and energy is now spent on criticizing these new regulations for AI and saying they stop innovation, they hinder innovation. It's just making it too complicated. And I get that, because when I first looked at what was written there, I thought, well, that's an incredible. Not only is it an incredible amount of work, my initial thesis was that basically every AI system in existence today will probably have to be rewritten from scratch, um, because the thinking behind what the AI Act and these other regulations envision are a process. They're not an end state. They're not just a goal. They
Yeah.
tell you before you write the first line of code, here's some things to think about. And I guarantee you, the programmers 20 years ago that were writing in languages that are not used today anymore were not thinking about that.
Right. Right. And in so many ways, I do, right or wrong, I think many people that are bound to the new regulations, the regulations that are currently enforced, recognize that those regulators and standards body might not necessarily have an equivalent amount of skin in the game. And so, in many ways, it almost feels like these businesses are being held to a standard that others are not. Um,
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. But of course, if you put yourself in the shoe of the legislator, right, the people in Congress, in Parliament that pass these laws, like they have an intent, they have a goal they want to achieve.
yes.
And when you look at the AI Act, but other AI regulations, what are they thinking about when passing these laws? And we can go into what's happening in the United States on the legislative front. They're looking at this as consumer protection. So they're thinking about their voters, they're thinking about their citizens, and what how they might be protected from harms that come from a new class of products. And so when you then turn it around, why are politicians doing it? It's because when you ask the public, hey, do you like AI? Do you feel optimistic, or do you feel more pessimistic? Are you more skeptical? It doesn't matter where you run the survey. You run it in the United States, you run it in Europe, you run it in Switzerland, you run it in Asia. The answer comes back 60 to 80% of people, they don't like AI. They're skeptical of it. They're scared of it. They're scared they'll take away their jobs. And so for politicians, they look at that and they say, okay, well, maybe it is actually my job to do something here to address that. And that's why we get these rules. Whether they're good or not, or whether they're fit for purpose or not, that's another question, but that's where they come from.
But Kevin, I think you're right. I think we do have to assume positive intent and fit for purpose, fit for use, right or wrong. I do think you're right in that the intent of each and every new regulation that comes forth is to essentially lay boundaries. The idea of the soccer pitch. On a soccer pitch, you know where you can run really, really fast because you know where the end lines are. Outside the end lines, you're out of bounds. Inside the end lines, you go as hard as you want to go. And I think the regulation form a boundary very similar to that if we approach them the right way. But then, Kevin, I also see two very distinct and different looks at how regulation should be enforced to protect the consumer, to protect the citizen. We have the EU approach, and then we have the US approach, which, as of today, really take almost polar opposite tacks. In the US, it seems with the rollback of recent executive orders, or the recent rollback of executive orders, that is, we're pulling back a little bit from an overall federal approach to AI regulation and AI safety, where in the EU, we're really leaning into ensuring that we're doing the right thing, again, from a consumer
Mhm.
protection perspective.
I mean, there's a sort of top down versus bottom up approach here. So the EU basically said, we want harmonized rules for the entire common market, right?
Yeah.
So AI systems that are on the EU market, they all follow the same rules. In the United States, the executive order that you mentioned mostly affected actually the federal government itself. It basically laid down ground rules that if the federal government was going to procure or build an AI system, here are the things that it should meet.
Mhm.
And that, of course, has now been rescinded. And what's happening instead in the United States is it's a bottom up approach where the states are thinking about, well, how do we want to have AI regulated in our states? And of course, California is a trailblazer there.
Lead
But
down.
actually, the big law that's already in effect, that's still mostly under the radar, is in Colorado. Texas is considering a sweeping law, and then depending on definition, most of the states are thinking about some kind of AI law.
And I think in the states, Utah and Colorado, to your point, Colorado's, I believe, is SB 205 for those who want to look this up. It actually calls for those systems that are considered to be high risk, and they do a pretty good job of defining what high risk means to them um, in the legislation itself. But it calls for those organizations that are deploying high risk systems to employ one of two known good frameworks, either the NIST AI risk management framework or the recently minted ISO 42001, which is a full on AI management system, really centered around governance and management of the AI lifecycle. And so I really do think that's a perspective that many others need to consider adopting is, that there are so many things, that there is so much risk associated with new technologies, with emerging technologies. Let's focus on ensuring that we protect the consumers against those risks, but let's do it in a repeatable way that we can explain to others.
Absolutely. What we see is as very different places, you mentioned Utah and Colorado together with the EU, but also now South Korea and Brazil.
Yes.
They write these AI laws. And then the standards bodies come up with technical specifications and technical standards for how to do it. They're actually more similar to each other than people realize. So, and that's why the Colorado law, as you say, can call out these standards and say, well, if you do that, you're basically you're fine. And there's a reason for that, which I point out, but that seems to not be well known. So this is like
Tell us.
something really cool for your audience here.
Tell us.
So back when the AI Act was like this total Brussels insider topic that nobody in New York cared about, I went and basically talked to the staffers at the commission that were drafting it. And I asked them, like, what do you know about AI? Well, not much. What do you know a lot about? Well, we all just came off drafting the medical device regulation. And a while later, like a light went off in my head. I was like, they basically chose the same approach as medical device regulation in the EU for AI. And there are two important choices that were made here. One is going to be the product that they wanted to regulate. So the the whole thing, the whole system, not the AI model itself, number one. And number two, there would be this risk tiering. And the risk tiering looks different in different locations, but it's basically an X-ray machine is much more risky than a much simpler device like a
Metal
healthcare
detector,
health
whatever the case
device.
may be. Yeah, yeah.
And this is like the ancestor DNA of all AI regulation is actually in medical devices, and then everybody in the United States and other countries assumes that AI regulation looks like product conformity plus risk tiering. And that's why it all looks so similar.
Yes, that's interesting. And I almost see, at least for me, a failure to connect because as I think about AI in general, I think of the socio-technical system, and I almost think of AI in many ways as a service, not necessarily a product. And so I struggle to connect the dots in some ways between the service, which is very intangible in so many ways, co-created, versus the product, which is created and can be shipped. It feels like maybe those things are a little bit different. And Kevin, maybe that's where some of the disconnect in having a real conformity standard for users around the QMS for the EU
Mm-hmm.
AI Act is stemming from, bridging this gap between tangible and intangible.
Absolutely. It comes from the fact that AI systems are virtual, they're software, and they have a very different supply chain than, machinery,
Yes,
which of course also has a supply chain, but which is much more clear. I'm buying the widgets from you, Patrick, and I put them into my widget and I sell it on to my
very
customer, right?
discreet.
That's
Yes,
really clear.
yes.
But maybe somebody is like scraping our recording right now and using as training data for a model, and then they're like, what is our relationship? It's already much less clear about how we relate to each other. And I think that
Yes.
when we think about business leaders, um, one thing they should be really clear on is that we are now all our organizations, we're all going to be part of this AI supply chain that starts with the
Mhm.
super smart people at the foundation model labs that train the frontier models that then propagate out together with the training data and the data that's collected later into system, get packaged and repackaged and repackaged. And so it sounds like such a cliche, but today every company is an AI company because we're all part of that supply chain.
Yes, totally agree. There is no one that is untouched by AI at this point, whether we recognize it or not. And Kevin, I do think that's where part of the risk stems from, is this lack of awareness, lack of acknowledgement. But that's really where, as you're describing these levels of risk that you called forth, organizations have an opportunity to stop and think about themselves in context and how they really are participating in the overall ecosystem.
Hmm.
That said, are there, in your opinion, are there verticals or markets that are set to be more impacted, those that are set to be less impacted by the regulation that's really here today?
So I usually basically give the opposite answer to what people expect. I think highly regulated industries like financial services, like healthcare, they are of course impacted, but they know how to deal with this. So a company that makes medical devices, they
Oh,
look at AI regulations as, oh, here's another standard I need to meet. Here's another certification.
one
I
more.
know how to deal with that.
Yes.
The companies that are going to be more impacted are the companies that don't even realize yet that they've become AI companies and that their product now is an AI product, and that they have these obligations, both the risks that they inherit from their suppliers and then the obligations they have towards their customers. And so I think about um, you know software that goes into education, right? Like how do we help children learn and train and assess them, right? That's not the same as a credit risk in financial services, which is very well understood according to the EU and according to plenty of other jurisdictions now. Software that determines your grades, that determines your success in education, is now considered high risk. And for those kind of companies, it's going to be much harder to adjust to this.
Oh my goodness. My goodness. And then, Kevin, and again, from your perspective, for those organizations that are operating today with high risk systems, as they look at not just their current obligations, but the obligations that will be coming with the rollout of enforcement of some of the provisions of the AI Act, what's next? I mean, what is the next big obstacle that these organizations are going to have to face?
So the big deadline that's looming, and thinking about it as the point when you need to be done, not the point when you need to be started, is August in 2026. So about a year and a half from now.
Okay.
By then, all high risk systems, if they are offered on the EU market, will have to have completed the whole process to have done the conformity assessment, be certified, and receive the CE mark.
Registered.
So if you know what that process is like, and some in your audience will know, and maybe some have never done it, a year and a half is already very tight to go from end to end. So I would urge them to look into what do they need to get started to operate a system and then have it certified. So that's I think the biggest deadline. The other risk that's under the surface, so just again from the EU perspective here, is that the prohibited AI practices, these are now banned since the beginning of February, and those carry the highest fines, up to 7% of your global turnover, minimum of 35 million euros. And before you think, well, yeah, but this is all theoretical, who's going to do anything about that? We just saw that a few days ago, a class action lawsuit was filed in Germany. Class action is actually, in the United States, it's a well-known thing.
Well known
In
thing.
Europe, it's actually a legal novelty. A class action lawsuit has been filed against X and TikTok, and particularly called out TikTok under multiple laws, not just the AI Act, but also the
Yes.
Markets Act and the Services Act.
PSA, GDPR. Yes.
Exactly. And it called out particularly TikTok for manipulative AI practices. And those are banned. And that lawsuit is looking for damages in the multiple billions of euros. And so if you're an American company, or if you're a non-European company operating a service today, and you think, well, what do I care about the Act? I'm not in the EU. I'm not doing anything prohibited. At least I think so. I hope so.
I hope so.
You are exposed, even as an overseas company, if you have any kind of customers in Europe, and you already run the risk of having people take legal action because they feel harmed.
And Kevin, for those organizations that are at risk, I mean, I think I've made my opinion on this very plain, so I won't repeat it now, unless we want to. But what can they do in lieu of a well-defined conformity standard for the EUAI Act, or for well-defined conformity standard for the QMS for the EUAI Act? Are there models?
So this is a challenge, and the answer is basically stick to the international standard, the ISO standard, this 42001 standard, the AI management system. Um, does it do everything the AI Act asks you to do? No.
No.
Does it do everything that Colorado asks you to do? Actually, yes, because Colorado says if you have 42001, that's sort of presumed you're doing your job right.
Yes.
And I think that's sort of the theme. 42001, it's generic, it's open, it's extendable. And so we'll give your organization a basis for operating in your new world. And
Yes.
so when we do get those harmonized standards from Europe, there will be a delta, right? There will be some changes you will need to make. But most of the work will already have been done and hopefully actually audited and assessed externally, so you can evidence that.
And Kevin, you said something there that I think a lot of people do hear as detriments, as almost flaws of ISO 42001, and that is that it can be a little bit high level and a little bit generic. But that last word that you said, it's extendable. 42001, as with any other ISO management system, is meant to be extensible to wrap around the scope and the context unique to the organization that's employing it. So 42001 is meant to be custom fit. It's almost like a tailored suit that organizations have an opportunity to have fit to themselves and then extend it out as necessary for external obligations, like any regulation that might be pertinent to the geography that they're operating within.
Absolutely. And we see the market response to precisely those advantages already, which is that ahead of those legal deadlines, which sounds scary, but it's still a while away, the market reaction is to essentially say, well, if I as an organization no longer feel like I can ignore the risk of procuring AI services or products, and so I'm going to start asking for this kind of certification. And towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, we saw a rush of some very prominent AI companies announcing their 42001 certifications. We can list here for sure Google Cloud, Amazon AWS, Anthropic, the AI company.
Yes.
A bunch of professional services firms have done it. Palantir has done it. And this is all done in anticipation, if you think about it, of customer requirements. So in 2025, business leaders should think about whatever you procure in the AI world better come with some sort of evidence that what you're buying meets some minimum standard. And a company like Palantir or a company like AWS is not going to invest in a certification like that if they didn't think it was going to be essential to do business, and they did.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And in fact, very, very early on, before 42001 was finalized, a good friend, Kim Lucy, I think you know Kim, and Kim, if you're listening, thanks for letting me name drop. As she was articulating the need for 42001 to the global community, there were really two main drivers. First, it does allow for governance of the entire AI lifecycle for an organization, which is, benefit enough in and of itself. But secondly, 42001 is a mechanism to offer value, to offer assurance through the entire supplier value chain for an organization. And so as I do think about 42001 as a necessary tool for organizations who are preparing either for lack of regulation or for what feels like overly burdensome regulation, it's an opportunity to show your market, to offer to your market some value in assurance that you're doing the right things as you develop or deploy AI systems.
So I talk a lot of large enterprise customers in Europe for our company, and I ask the leaders there, what are you concerned about? Like you clearly you're interested in AI governance. What are your concerns? And the number one answer is, I don't know what I'm buying. I have 500 vendors and I don't know what I'm getting. And I have to sort of anonymize this example a little bit. Very early on, like middle last year, we were contacted by a big sports fashion brand, and I was like, "What could they possibly want to do with AI
What is
governance?"
this?
And they said, um, we would love to use AI in marketing. We would love to use Gen AI to generate these marketing campaigns that use this technology. And we are terrified of accidentally committing copyright infringement because we don't know what all these vendors that come and pitch to us, we don't know what's in their system. We don't trust them. And for me, that was sort of a light going off moment. I was like, I realized most large organizations, they feel capable of handling AI regulation internally. They know how to do this. Maybe they need a little bit of help, but in general, they know how to set up systems and live with them. What they cannot do easily is find trust in their supply chain, in their vendors. And that's where standards and certifications come in.
And Kevin, as you're saying this, it's dawning on me. Even Microsoft has taken this approach through the recent changes to their SSPA program, wherein they recognize as an alternative certification path ISO 42001 for systems that are for suppliers that are using AI systems.
And you know what was really interesting about that is, and you wrote about this, is that what Microsoft considers quote unquote high risk is not the same as the AI Act, it's not the same as
No.
Colorado, it's not the same as anyone else. Um, so um, I want to contrast that with, so again, conversations I have with customers in Europe, particularly more on the provider side, so the startups, the SMEs that build these services, they're in, the 5 stages of grief, right? They were
Yeah.
sort of in the denial phase, like, no, 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 we don't actually use AI, or if we do, it's not high risk, like we don't need to do anything. And so now we're starting to see the transition to the anger phase, like, damn it, I have to do all this work now, and soon we will reach acceptance. But it's basically this idea that in this coming world, if you're in the AI business, that you somehow will be able to avoid doing anything. And I think that's a fallacy. And I think the companies that take responsible AI and AI governance serious early on, they will have an advantage because when it comes to that big enterprise deal, if you don't have the certificate, you're probably just eliminated at this point.
And
Or
Kevin,
if not today, very soon.
and this will be a generalization, but I would say that it's not just those that are expressly in the AI business. I would say it's those in business. Because,
Yes.
again, whether recognized or not, AI very likely is being used in some way to deliver value to customers. Those customers might be internal to your organization or just your users, they might be external. But I think
Mhm.
most businesses today are not untouched. If if that's the right way to put it, most businesses today are influenced in some way, shape, or form by AI systems.
I mean, this is a very technical and boring debate, and you can cut me off here if you think this is
No,
not relevant. But
bring it.
even the definition of AI has been an incredibly controversial subject. Like I remember the original draft of the AI Act just listed a bunch of things, and it started off with things like we would all agree are AI, machine learning and deep learning and convolutional neural networks. And then it started saying things like Bayesian inference and symbolic logic, which I think at that point every piece of computer code would have been considered
Yes.
AI. And then there was this long back and forth, this process also with the OECD about having some sort of general definition of an AI system. And this OECD definition turned out to be very influential. It's in the AI Act. It's in the law proposals in the US, and it's an unclear definition. Like for a while, people were saying, well, in this definition, like the regression in my Excel spreadsheet can be considered AI. And then people complained about it, and then the EU wrote a 140-page document to try and clarify what is and isn't an AI system. And I have to say, I understand less about what is an AI system now after this explanation than I understood before. And but that's a danger. You
That
can
is a
probably
danger.
convince yourself that your product actually is maybe not AI.
Yes.
Maybe you'll even convince the regulator, but you will not convince the customer.
Yeah, a very, very low chance of convincing the customer. It's interesting. They say ambiguity is hypnotic, and I do think
Yes.
many organizations are walking around in a state of hypnosis today because they just don't know where to turn, and the definitions are vague. The regulations in many cases are vague. We currently have regulations in force without known good standards or guidance to adhere to
Mhm.
those regulations. So it's a very, very difficult time.
I mean, you have probably more experience than me with this because back then I didn't pay attention to this. But when GDPR and data protection first became a thing, right? Nobody knew really what is personal data and what does data protection really mean, right? We had to
Right.
navigate these things and figure it out. And today, it's routine and everybody is sensitized to this idea that if I'm using data and a particular data related to a person, I have to be careful. And I think we'll reach the same point with AI in 2, 3, 4 years maybe. And today we're still puzzled by what all this means.
Yes. Yeah. And what I think is interesting is, to your point, Kevin, this isn't much different than things we've seen in the past. As an example, with HIPAA, the HIPAA regulation here in the
Hmm.
United States, we know, particularly with electronic protected health information, EPHI, there are certain things that must be done and certain things that should not be done. And it just makes sense. I think as we translate or transition away from the very specific example to the more general example, I think we lose people with that understanding. We have to protect data. We have to protect the security and privacy of data if we're going to do the right thing to really be good stewards.
Well, it's the vertical versus the horizontal. HIPAA is easier
Yeah,
to understand because we all know what medical records and what medical data is. We don't need to explain it. But
right.
when we say now we need to protect personal data, well, what is personal data? And it's the same with AI. AI regulations are horizontal. So am I using? Are we? We're recording this on a piece of software. Does this piece of software not count as an AI system? I'm not sure. It might.
The logistic regression. I
Yeah.
vividly remember doing multivariate analysis to see which variables influenced an outcome. In those instances, the logistic regression, am I AI? Am I using
Hmm.
Excel in such a way that I would need to conform to some sort of standard related to AI? And I know
I mean,
that's a stretch.
I have seen people do whole LLMs, very simple ones, but whole LLMs in Excel. So absolutely, Excel is AI.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Whole new world. Whole new world, Kevin. Hey, one of the things that I've seen you write about recently are, first of all, and I think this is more timely. So for our listeners, depending on when you're listening, this might or might not be an influence, but the recent rollback of the AI liability directive.
Hmm.
I think there was significant wailing and gnashing of teeth, for lack of better words, when that rolled back. And I think for good reason. I think what we're starting to see now are individual um, member state regulations come online, so that now, instead of a single directive that everyone could subscribe to, now potentially we'll have 27 or more directives that member states need to follow depending on how they're operating. Is that something that you're hearing in the people that you're speaking with?
Yeah, I mean, the AI liability directive was considered an important part of the EU's sort of digital agenda and sort of essentially regulating the digital space. And at a core, maybe we should say what the AI liability directive basically strengthened the rights of the consumer vis-a-vis big tech companies.
Yes.
And one thing that they introduced was a reversal of the burden of proof. So if I felt damaged by a big tech company, I could bring a lawsuit and then they would have to demonstrate that they didn't harm me. Now, without that liability directive, I kind of have to prove that big tech harmed me, which is, of course, much, much harder for me as an individual
Yes.
than if this directive was in place. Now, as you said, the directive was withdrawn, so at least for now, it's not imminent. Will it return in some fashion? It might. But as our good common friend Peter Henze pointed out, now there are 27 AI liability directives, and that's always the problem in Europe, where if something is not done at the European level, then you have 27 different ways of doing it, written in many different languages and different legal systems, which of course makes it more challenging to operate rather than less. Right? That's the advantage of a country like the US as 50 states. But federal law basically makes it very easy to do business across state lines.
Yes.
And in the EU, they're not quite there yet.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, the role of the federal government is to ensure that we can do business across state lines, amongst other things. But one of the chief focuses. So I do think it's interesting that here in the states we, at least as of yet, have taken serious steps forward. Which, as I say that, that's not entirely true. You, in fact, pointed out to me a Senate bill that's in place today in the U.S. Yet to come into enforcement, yet to be voted on, but a bill that proposes some pretty solid federal level regulation of AI. Would you care to talk about that for just a moment, Kev?
Sure. I mean, the current administration is um, strongly against the idea, or talks like they're strongly against the idea of regulating AI, and that we should not hinder innovation, and we should support business. And I agree with that sentiment. But of course, with so many things, it's more important to look what they do versus what they say. And aside from the rhetoric, there is this bill in the Senate introduced by the majority that, I don't want to say is the same as the AI Act, but it would fulfill a similar purpose in the US. And this seems to be being advanced. And even if this bill doesn't make it, I would not be surprised to see some sort of federal legislation in the US, because if every state has its own AI law, even if they say if you have 42,001, you're fine, it's going to be really messy, and that's going to be a need to have a federal solution to make it easier to do business.
And we see it with privacy today. Largely, the states are responsible for their privacy directives. And we do see issues wherein enforcement is really a matter of political gain. I hate to say it that way, but generally, we don't see action taken unless there is an opportunity to position something politically for the state or the state attorneys general. So, from an AI perspective, I do think it's important that we consider what it looks like to have overarching regulation that states can then operate within. Because to your point, regulation standards, I'll say that standards
Mm-hmm.
can be set in such a way that they don't hamper innovation, they facilitate it. And I really do think that's the opportunity in front of us.
I would also, when I encounter this discussion that laws like the AI Act, they add bureaucratic burden, and they hamper innovation, and they do, of course, because
Yes.
it's more work. But if you look at what is the core that the AI Act wants you to do, what is the core that the NIST standards ask you to do, or the law in Colorado, they basically say have a sensible process in place to think about the risks that your product might cause, and have a process for mitigating those,
Yes.
and ideally documented.
Yes.
Um, and that's just good business, right? You don't want to put something on the market that's broken and it's going to harm your customers. You want to have a product that's safe, that's reliable, that's trustworthy, where you can tell your customer, use this, you can trust it, which I think for AI products is particularly interesting and particularly important.
Uh,
And so you should want some level of sensible AI regulation and some sensible AI standards, so that you can go on the market and say, look, you can trust this.
Yes, yes. At the end of the day, governance is about value creation. ISACA, and I've talked about this a few times, so pardon me to those that have heard me say this before, but ISACA says that governance is a value creation process. It's centered on creating desired outcomes at optimized risk and cost. Not minimal risk and cost, but at optimized risk and cost. And so organizations have to know what it is they want to create. And then, based on their own scoping and context, they have to determine what optimized risk and cost they're prepared to bear to create that thing. And that's what I love so much about the frameworks, particularly ISO 42001, is that it does give a framework to think through to allow organizations to do just that. To say, this is who I am, this is what's important to me as an organization. Therefore, if those things are true, these are the behaviors that I need to engage in to ensure that I'm creating maximum benefit for my stakeholders and shareholders. It really
Mm-hmm.
is a very clean, very simple way to connect the dots in my mind.
And I think there's an extra step that's particularly important. And you basically had somebody who's not part of the organization take a look at it, and say, yeah, actually you did
Yeah.
this well. Or I found some issues, and maybe you should make some changes here. I recommend, you say you do this, but actually you don't. Maybe
But
you
actually,
should.
no. Yeah,
I
let's do
think
it
that's a
right.
good thing.
Yes. Yeah. Again, this integrity, this alignment between our words and behaviors. Yes.
Yes.
And
Hey, we as an organization, right? So we build software to help implement things like the AI Act, and we use AI in our product, and so we are intensely focused on the dog fooding aspect of this. So we've deliberately not done our ISO 42001 yet, because as we build our AI systems, we can convince ourselves that we can do this well, and that when we do go forward and ask for our certification, we'll be able to do it easily and demonstrate that all the work we've done into thinking particularly about AI agents. This is a whole nother rabbit hole we can talk about.
oh my
We
goodness.
build agent systems. How do we build those in a trustworthy, reliable way? Like what assurances can we give? What assurances can't we give? And how do we communicate that? That's very, very important from us from a mission perspective.
Yes. And again, another area where definitions are lacking. The whole concept of agents versus agent workflows versus plain workflows. I think there's a lot of ambiguity around what that means. And there's a lot of confusion in the market today. So that's another area that I do see becoming even riskier as time goes on.
There's another challenge embedded in that for business leaders. Um, when you think about, okay, what do I need to do to be current here on the regulation front? And the answer is it's very, very difficult, not because so much is happening, but also because the time scale on which Congress, Parliament, standards bodies can react to technological change is now too slow compared to the pace of innovation, right? The big tech companies and those amazing AI labs, like they ship new types of systems every few weeks now. And so the process of writing a law, right? We all know from our days in school how laws are made, right?
Yeah.
That takes time, and it takes time for a reason, right? So that everybody can have their say and things can be considered. And there's a process for it. That process takes much longer than it takes for the smart minds at one of those tech companies to come up with a new thing that nobody's ever thought about before. And that's going to be a real challenge going forward.
And Kevin, I would say it's the same with standards, not just the regulation that seeks to
Yes.
ensure that there's consistency, but also those standards bodies that are creating the processes that allow for consistency. They suffer the same issues.
Absolutely. I mean, we basically following multiple different regulations and standards and building our own systems, and we realized that when it came to our agents, there were things that were either missing or didn't quite make sense, and so we wrote a whole white paper on here are the things that are already sort of not working well anymore. And so when you think about the next technical standards, here's we didn't offer solutions, right? Because don't know how to solve that yet.
Right.
But here's some things to think about that are already maybe not fitting into the schemes and definitions that have been approved for these standards.
And for our listeners, for our viewers, to Kevin's point, he has led the creation of many incredible white papers. And Kevin, these are available from the Modulus website. I think you have a resources section. We'll provide a link out for our viewers to actually follow through. But in particular, look at the paper on AI agents. Kevin, I think you published this a month ago, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Yeah, and we're already essentially talking to the standards bodies and say like, well, maybe we should have a working group or committee to look into a standard for specifically for agent systems. And my worry at the back of my head is that by the time that process has started and then the people have started contributing to it, agents maybe are no longer relevant because something else has come along.
We've moved along. Yes, emergent properties. It's an
Mm.
amazing thing. And Kevin, as we begin to conclude our time, two things for our listeners. First of all, is there anything that you feel is important for business leaders to know that we haven't talked about today? Secondly, from your perspective as leader of Modulus AG, what can Modulus do to serve the community, to help our leaders get better, and to create the outcomes that they actually seek to create?
So the thing to keep in mind as you think about your organization today is you are an AI company. You are importing or inheriting risks, and you're exposed to new types of risks that are now emerging. So I think I would urge everyone to take action. And the first thing you can do is do an assessment, an audit of how many AI systems you have. And I think you will be surprised by how many more you have and how risky they are. So I am sort of collecting statistics from people who do these audits, and the numbers sort of come back differently. But like I just heard a story about a mid-sized company doing machinery in Germany, where 450 AI systems were discovered, which is more than 10 times more than the management thought there were. And a third of them were considered high risk under the AI Act, and they had no idea. So if you're listening to this, if you're a leader in an organization, start looking and see what already exists, what maybe people have built and didn't think much about it or just didn't tell you, that expose you to risk. So that would be my number one piece of advice.
And Kevin, just to follow up before you move on to number two, is ignorance an excuse or an opportunity to forego conformity to the standards laid forth by the AI Act?
Ignorance is not an excuse
Not
before
an
the law.
excuse. Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
So what does Modulus do? I mean, we basically took the AI Act and then of course all these other standards and basically said, how would an organization implement these processes in particular? How would they automate as much as possible, keeping human oversight, of course, in place? We built a software platform that does that. And in particular, we very early on went all in on AI agents in order to automate and bring governance, risk, and compliance to sort of the next level. So from the static automation era that has been with us for a few years now, and bring it to the more dynamic AI agent era, where systems continuously monitor your infrastructure and tell you, hey, you might have a gap here, a risk, or a regulatory concern. Address it proactively. That's what we do. That's what we want to build, and we've already helped. And going back to the 42001, organizations achieve that, including the first one in Germany.
Outstanding. And then, Kevin, you didn't say this, but for our listeners, Kevin is recognized as one of the leading subject matter experts on the EU Act, the work that you're doing, not only for yourself, as yourself, but also through your organization, Modulos. And it's just a wealth of knowledge. So, Kevin, I hate to volunteer you, but again, to our listeners, as you do run into situations, as you do have questions, reach out, please. Kevin Schawinski, thank you so much for making time today. I'm grateful for you, man. I really am.
Thank you, Patrick. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, same. For our viewers, Kevin Schawinski, Modulos AG, we'll include in the show notes links out to Kevin's site, links out to the resources and blogs on Kevin's site. But until next time, thank you all so much for making the space. Have a great day.